tracking that, and I will ask our panelists questions and kind of interrupt them, because my guess is some people will have similar questions. So just to begin, I thought I would give some sort of general introduction to Judaism and feminism and sort of frame the conversation. And then I will invite Dr. Michal Rauscher to join in, and Maharat Roy Pickerney. So I will introduce the two of these two amazing, wonderful ladies in just a moment. So just to get started, jumping in, a really quick few-minute overview of liberal Judaism and feminism. So when I say liberal Judaism, I mean Judaism outside of Orthodoxy. So that would be Reconstructionist, Reform, and Conservative Judaism would be the main three that I would be talking about. So for most of its history, Judaism has been a patriarchal religion, and women were seen to have a lower status than men. The traditional domain for women was in the home. And although women may have been the ones like preparing the food in the home, it was the men who regulated like the dietary laws. So they had really important roles, but it was really the men who came in and sort of regulated these areas for the women. And the religious activities that took place in the public sphere outside the home, such as study and prayer and a lot of the mitzvot, were considered only mandatory for men. So when the Reform movement came along, so we're jumping ahead a long time, but when the Reform movement came along in the 19th century, they adopted some measures which were intended to equalize the role of women in the synagogue. So this is really our first push for women to be equal in the synagogue, but it really wasn't until the 1970s that Judaism began to change in response to the feminist critique. And this came about because of the feminist revolution in the 1960s. So after that period of time, it was only a matter of time before women's rising consciousness of social and economic iniquities would extend to religious communities as well. So that movement sparked something in all women, and it then moved into the religious sphere. So I wanted to share, I just created one slide, but I thought as I go through this next part, it might be a little bit easier to follow along. I practiced this. Let me see if I can share it. There we go. So I just wanted to highlight a few key dates for women in the rabbinate. I think it's easier to see this part. So in the 1970s, so I mentioned in the 1960s how there was this feminist revolution, and then it moved into the religious sphere. So in the 1970s, Judaism began to respond to the feminist critique. In 1968, RRC, which is the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, opened its college doors, and it was always open to ordaining women, but it ordained its first female rabbi, who was Sandy Sasso, in 1973. And then 1 year before that, in 1972, Hebrew Union College, which is the Reform Seminary, made the decision to ordain women and ordained its first female rabbi, Sally Presand, which happened in 1972. And then one other key date for liberal circles, because I know my colleagues are going to go into more traditional circles. In 1983, the Jewish Theological Seminary, JTS, which is the conservative seminary, sanctioned women's ordination and ordained its first female rabbi, Amy Alberg, in 1985. So even though we talk about feminism and Judaism, and it's been around for a while, it really hasn't been around as long as we think. It's just, I would say, maybe such an ingrained part of how we today see our Judaism that maybe we don't stop to think about that only in the past 40, 50 years were women treated as equals in this realm and were able to become spiritual leaders and religious leaders. So I'm going to stop sharing that just for a minute. If you want that information, I'm happy to send it to anyone. But again, like, it's pretty recent that we're moving into this realm where women have a larger role in Judaism. And so as more women became rabbis and cantors, it became commonplace for women to accept all these religious responsibilities and benefits that in the past were really reserved for men. So for example, like, I wrote my thesis on reclaiming the mikvah. The mikvah is an immersion pool. We use it for what's called nida, which is when a woman has her period and then goes to the mikvah to become pure again. That's not quite the right language, but that's the general concept. We use it for conversion when someone is becoming Jewish. And it has, as someone who has been to the mikveh a lot, I love it. But before I got married, for instance, I took my mom with me to go to the mikveh, and she was very uncomfortable with the whole experience. So in response to some of these more traditional pieces of Judaism, women are reclaiming them for themselves. So I wrote my thesis on mikveh and how it's being reclaimed, and how people are going for birthdays and momentous life occasions, and really owning it for their own purposes, as well as the traditional purposes. There are women's prayer and study groups now. If we think about like Rosh Chodesh groups, there is a whole strand of Jewish theology that is written by women and God that is re-envisioned in a new like Jewish era, I would say, when women have a more prominent role. Women are writing new versions of Midrashim, which are stories that are written sort of to fill in the gaps of the Torah. There's all sorts of amazing, amazing modern Midrashim written by women about women's roles. And so we're really like moving into a realm where women have a larger voice, I would say. And that's really wonderful, but really important to note. And the way it looks in liberal circles is not exactly what it looks like in more Orthodox traditional Jewish circles. So I'm really excited to have our guests speak to that in just a minute. The one other thing I wanted to touch on before I introduce our guest is that trends sort of parallel what I talked about before with the dates and women rabbis. Rabbi Susan Talvi was the first female rabbi to come to St. Louis. And when she came, there was mostly men. But today, if you look around, the senior rabbis at many of the Reformed congregations in St. Louis are women. I think maybe Rabbi Jim Bennett's the only man who was a senior rabbi in St. Louis, which is remarkable that, in 50 years, we've moved to this point in our history. So I think that's something to really note and be proud of in St. Louis, but it's not necessarily normal across the board. You should know that as well. When I went to Cincinnati before I moved to St. Louis and started working at CRC, I was the first female rabbi hired by the conservative congregation I worked at. So even though we've made a lot of strides, we're still continuing to make strides in some of these areas. And that also raised some complex realities for me, just because in the conservative movement, people are sometimes more connected to Orthodoxy. And so they tend to want men for certain traditions and rituals. And that certainly raised some questions for me as a female rabbi working in that. But everyone, was typically wonderful and open to the conversation. But I was the first female rabbi actually hired at that synagogue. So we're really still working towards women's inclusion and what it really looks like when women are rabbis. And then I will say one other thing before I introduce our guests is, when we look around at Orthodox leadership, it is mainly men. And in St. Louis, and also the conservative movement is mainly men. But as you all know, a few years ago, Maharat Rory Picker-Nice was hired in St. Louis, which really shifted that trend and speaks to the trends that are happening in the Orthodox community today. So that's where I'm going to stop. That was a lot of information all thrown at you, but I wanted to give you a sense of what the journey has been like and how it's really a new journey. This is not something that's been going on for 100 years. This has been going on for maybe 50 years. And we've made great strides, but there's a lot more we can do. And there's a lot more that I'm hoping Maharat Rory and Dr. Michal will open our eyes to that's happening in this world that we aren't even aware of, because there's a lot out there, a lot of wonderful things are happening with women. So I am going to introduce our guests to you all. I'm going to start with Dr. Michal Rauscher. She is an assistant professor of Jewish studies at Rutgers University. And before she moved to New Jersey, she was an assistant professor of Judaic studies at the University of Cincinnati, which is where our paths crossed. We had a couple really wonderful years together. It was really special and great. Dr. Rauscher conducted ethnographic research on reproductive ethics of Haredi or ultra-Orthodox Jewish women in Israel. This is her primary research. And for 2 years, she interviewed ultra-Orthodox women in their homes in Jerusalem and spoke to them about their reproductive lives. Her book, which is based on this research, will be published by Indiana University Press in November, and it's called Conceiving Agency, Reproductive Authority Among Haredi Women. And for the last 4 years, Michal has been researching the ordination of women in Orthodoxy. This is her second research topic. And her publications and research lie at the intersection of the anthropology of Jewish women, reproductive ethics, and Israel studies. So we welcome Dr. Michal Rauscher, and she's going to speak, and then Maharat Rory Picker-Nice will speak. So I'm going to go on and introduce her so we can have an easier transition. Some of you probably know her. Maharat Rory Picker-Nice is the executive director of the Jewish Community Relations Council, the JCRC, in St. Louis, and one of the first graduates of Yeshivat Maharat, a pioneering institution training Orthodox Jewish women to be spiritual leaders and halachic, or Jewish legal authorities. Our paths actually crossed in, I think it was 2016. Before I ever came to St. Louis, we went to Israel together. And so I'm so happy to welcome both of them. One other piece about Maharat Rory, she is passionate, as we know, about the intersection of Judaism, feminism, interfaith dialogue, and social justice, which very much speaks to her work in St. Louis. So I'd like to welcome them both, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Michal.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Or I guess I can only see you two, but you can hear me. Yes, great. Okay. Thanks everybody for being here with us tonight for this really, really exciting talk. I also am really passionate about talking about these things. So I'm thrilled to be here with you. Thank you, Rabbi Karen, for putting this all together. It's great to reconnect with old friends. Rabbi Karen was my rabbi in Cincinnati, so it's really great to be on this panel with you. And Maharat Rory and I also have this sort of interesting relationship. We're kind of interlocutors in this research that I'm doing, and so it's great to sort of see different dynamic pieces of our relationship develop. So I'm happy to be here. I'm also really happy that Rabbi Karen started with that slide, because that way I don't have to go through all that stuff. That was kind of, just in case Rabbi Karen didn't cover these dates, I would cover these dates too. So I'm going to focus on Orthodoxy, on women's ordination in Orthodoxy, because that's what I've been studying for a number of years. But I want to give sort of an important color to the dates that Rabbi Karen brought. And that is that even before women were officially ordained by these movements, in other words, even before the movements voted in their official capacity to not just let women into rabbinical school, which was just one piece of the puzzle, but also allow them to be ordained, even before that happened, women were playing rabbinic type roles in congregations in a variety of capacities. And I'll just give, and by the way, women have also been ordained not through rabbinical schools, which is also kind of, we often think of just the sort of official ordination of women as through rabbinical schools. But traditional ordination, in other words, centuries back, is one rabbi to a student, right? So the concept of a rabbinical school is even a more modern phenomenon. But I'll highlight just a couple of books if people are interested in books. I'm a big book suggester. So Pam Nadel's book, The Women Who Would Be Rabbis, it offers a great history of this. And the other one I'll tell you is Dr. Shuli Rubin Schwartz's book, The Rebbitzin. And here's why these two books are really important. Pam Nadel's book provides a history of how it came. In other words, everything that led up to the rabbinical schools giving ordination. And some of the stuff that she talks about in that book is how women would serve in their congregations if their husbands were the rabbis, right? If their husbands died before the congregation hired a new rabbi, his wife would serve in a sort of rabbinic capacity until they found a new rabbi. So in the interim. So that's one kind of piece of the puzzle. The other is there's a very famous woman by the name of Ray Frank, who is known to have given the first sermon in North America. And she gave the sermon in Washington State on, I think, on Yom Kippur in 1890, I believe, before the turn of the century. So that was that was kind of, that's often marked by historians as also the sort of big moment for women's religious leadership. So that's another one. You may also have recently heard about a woman by the name of Regina Jonas, who was ordained in Germany in 1935. She sadly died in Auschwitz about 10 years later. And it's only recently that we know her story because a group of women rabbis went and did some archival work in 2014. So even that kind of really important piece, right? She was ordained by another rabbi, an individual ordination. Okay. And why are those things important? Oh, and sorry, the one last thing I'll tell you, I'm sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit, but the other piece is Dr. Shuli Schwartz's book on the Rebbitzin. And the reason why that's important is because Dr. Schwartz argues that women who served as rabbis' wives in America, even with their husbands alive and well serving in congregations, they also held certain kind of rabbinic capacity in their congregations, right? They were community leaders. They did a lot of pastoral care, a lot of things that we now associate with, and they did a lot of teaching, a lot of things that we now associate with things that rabbis do. She finds that historically, in other words, well before women were being ordained, women as rabbis' wives were doing this work as well. And the reason why I want to highlight the color of the color behind that story, those stories, is because I see a lot of those same things happening with the ordination of Orthodox women over the last 11 years, 12 years, right? And so there are a couple of pieces to this puzzle that I want to tease out. So first is the official first school ordaining women, right? As we know, you might have heard of Rabbi Sarah Hurwitz, who was at that time, the ceremony was called a conferral ceremony. This was in 2009. She was conferred as a Maharat, a title that we're all familiar with now. But at the time, it was a brand new title by Rabbi Avi Weiss. That was in 2009. The people inside that room and some of the people outside the room who had been following the story kind of knew what was going on, right? Knew that she was becoming an Orthodox female rabbi because she had her act, and because the ceremony was called a conferral ceremony, it almost went under the radar for a little bit. We don't actually see this big uproar that some of us might be familiar with until almost a year later. So 5 months after the conferral ceremony, Rabbi at the time, Maharat Hurwitz and Rabbi Avi Weiss decide they're going to open this seminary, right? They call it Yeshivat Maharat, to confer more women. Again, the language is intentionally vague so as not to upset too many people. And even then, they're getting like little rumblings, a little bit of opposition. 5 months after that, so again, now we're 10 months later after the initial ceremony, Rabbi Sarah Hurwitz kind of unceremoniously decides that she's going to put her title down on something she's committed to doing at a speaking invitation. She puts her title down as Rabbah instead of Maharat. And at that point, the Orthodox world exploded and said, hold on, and realized that she had now been serving as a female rabbi for more than a year, because she had been working in various capacities for more than a year. So 2009, 2010, we say, is the first official school ordination of a woman as a rabbi within Orthodoxy, except that there are a couple of women who came before. So 2004 and 2006, there were two women, Mimi Fagelson and Chaviva Ner David, who had been ordained in Jerusalem by Orthodox rabbis. And important to this, back to what I said, women had getting orthodoxy increasing levels of education in things like Gemara, which they had, right, rabbinic commentary, which they hadn't been for many centuries before that. So in the 1980s already, so even if we think the ordination of women in Orthodoxy is rather recent, in the 1980s already, schools in Israel had started providing rabbinic commentary, Gemara education, Talmud education to girls and young women. And yeah, I can't hear you. Probably can't hear
What was
anybody.
the reaction to the women starting to study those subjects?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm going to answer it in two ways. One, initially, the objection was really loud. And, because everybody understood what we now know very well through evidence, that once you start teaching people something, they know how to use it and manipulate it for their own gain. And that's not just women, that's not just feminism, that's sort of the reality of education. Right? So that things different and better and all of those things. So, okay, so initially it was really bad. Now education seems like sure, let's educate, give them all the education in the world as long as we don't ordain them, right? So the objection has switched. And now what you see is the more recent, statements from the Orthodox Union, the authority that oversees Orthodoxy, mostly in America. They put out these statements that say, we support women's education. Women should be educators. They should be educators in the highest realm of Orthodoxy, but just don't ordain them. So if you compare that to the statements they might have made 40 years ago, it's a total 180. So it's a great question. Okay, so there's the education piece. I know I only have a few minutes, so I just want to get at a couple of themes, and I'll tie this back to what I said before. Okay, so I've been looking at women's ordination in Orthodoxy, focusing mostly on those who have received ordination from Yeshivat Maharat in New York, which is where Maharat Rory got her smicha from. But I've also been looking at what's going on in Israel and some of the sort of cross-fertilization that's going on, because women are being ordained in Israel also under a sort of Orthodox umbrella. And I've noticed a couple of themes that I'm just going to mention in 2 minutes. I'll take more than 2 minutes, but I'll be brief. Okay, so one thing. I'm sorry if you can't tell, I'm very excited talking about this. I really love talking about it.
Take your time.
Okay. Okay, so I knew the 10 to 12 minutes was going to be a fail. I knew it. I should never have agreed to it. Okay, so one theme is that we see, as we know, that women's education is one of the sort of blessed areas now within Orthodoxy more broadly. We've seen a sort of typecast of women who have received ordination and the roles that they can fill. One of the roles that has become acceptable for these women rabbis to fill is that of what we call a scholar rabbi. And I'm distinguishing, sorry, I should back up a second. We know about 2 generations ago, the kind of rabbi that Orthodox congregations needed. These are male rabbis, but they needed what a colleague of mine calls a multitasking rabbi, a rabbi who could do everything. And that fit because congregations didn't have the budget for multiple rabbis. And, it was okay if they weren't leading services all the time because there were people in the congregation who could lead services. And so the rabbi could be off doing other things, could be teaching, could be raising money, could be doing pastoral care, a whole bunch of things. Then in the last generation or so, the same colleague of mine has noticed that the roles of the male rabbis have sort of focused in various ways. So people exit rabbinical school thinking, I'm going to work with youth, or, and this is men, right? I'm going to work with the youth in a congregation, or I'm going to be a rabbi who does administrative stuff for a nonprofit. And that's the training that they receive in rabbinical school. It's the type of internships they get, and they become sort of tunneled into particular roles that rabbis have. Some just do clergy work. So the kind of thing that I've noticed among women rabbis is very, very similar. So they're following the same trends that the male rabbis are following, which is really important, and I think says a lot about the normalization of women rabbis in Orthodoxy. So one of those tunnels is a scholar rabbi. And what I've found is that Yeshivat Maharat, the seminary that ordains women, also promotes their graduates as scholars. So when I've looked at some of the promotional material that they use, the programs that they organize, they talk about their graduates and their students as their scholars. Now, I think there are a couple of reasons for this. One, the women are really, really smart. A lot of them are coming, because they've gone through every level of education that Orthodoxy afforded them. They went to every program, the Drisha Scholars Circle or GPATs, or they were at, some of them, because they couldn't become rabbis, first went and got their PhDs. So they are very, very educated. So calling them scholars is not a misnomer at all. I also think, though, that calling them scholars is a way of making it more palatable to folks who may not be crazy about the idea of a female Orthodox rabbi, but, as I said before, are totally fine with female Orthodox scholars. So this way, if you want to have a woman speak in your congregation, you'll bring in a scholar. You may not want to call her rabbi, but you're okay having a scholar there. So that's kind of one track that they're tunneled in. Another track that I've noticed is what I call a Rebbitzin rabbi. Now, what does this mean? A Rebbitzin rabbi means a rabbi who fills a lot of pastoral needs for the congregation, or for the people that follow. Even if they're not in a congregation, a lot of them sometimes fill a kind of Rebbitzin rabbi role. And I'm referring here, when I've seen this phenomenon, I'm referring to a couple of things. One, the fact that Yeshivat Maharat has talked extensively about their great pastoral care program, which they do. They have a great pastoral care program. A lot of the women who graduate from Yeshivat Maharat, who receive smicha, speak very highly of their pastoral care program and the skills that they've gained through it. It's also, though, referred to as kind of innate skills that women have. And so there's a certain gendering to this kind of tunnel, right? There's a certain way in which we imagine the musmachot, to those who have been ordained from Yeshivat Maharat, as having both innate pastoral skills because they're women, and having been very well trained in pastoral care. So,
I have one question that goes kind of along with this.
Yeah.
So these women who are ordained, and specifically the scholars, but maybe also what you called the Rebbitzin rabbi track, are they only doing women feminist issues, or are they working with a greater Orthodox population?
Great question. And it's a great question. I think it's a great question, partially because it's one of the questions I ask them when I interview them. And the answer is always, most frequently, the answer is, I'm a rabbi for everybody. Most of the people who come to me with questions are women. But I'm a rabbi for everybody, and they are rabbis for everybody. And when I observe them in congregations, they are rabbis for everybody. Men approach them, women, they speak to men, they speak to women, they speak to children, everybody. So there's a lot more to that answer, but that's the answer that I get. So they're not just doing feminist issues. And some of them are actually kind of resistant to doing feminist issues for other reasons that I can kind of explore later on. But the Rebbitzin rabbi, okay, so part of it is that Yeshivat Maharat is training them for these roles, but part of it is also something that I've observed in the congregations that I've visited, is that a lot of the congregants have a tough time thinking about a woman in a leadership position in their synagogue who isn't the Rebbitzin. And that's because we've, and I'll put us all in that category. We all have a tough time fighting against gender norms that we've grown up with. And when we grow up in a congregation where the only woman in power is the rabbi's wife, it's hard to see a woman coming in not as the rabbi's wife. And so a number of women that I spoke to, and I do focus groups with the congregation also, and so a number of the interactions that I have tell me about instances where, the rabbah, the female Orthodox rabbi, is either compared to the Rebbitzin, compared and contrasted to the Rebbitzin, or confused for the Rebbitzin by people who don't know, or the male rabbis in these congregations, in trying to convince their congregants of the benefit of having a female rabbi, will say, think of the best Rebbitzin you've ever known, which is a way of helping people come around to the idea of having a female Orthodox rabbi. But it also, I think, hints at some of the gendering that's going on here. Okay. And I'll just add, yeah.
Just one more question. What about the husbands of these women? Because you mentioned how the women, like Rebbitzin has a special role. What happened with the husbands?
Yeah, that's a great question.
I'm interested.
Yeah, so there are some of them that make light of the situation and they refer to themselves as Rebbitz man, or they talk about their kugel. They kind of joke about it. There's an interesting dynamic that often happens where, female Orthodox rabbi, yes, she's ordained, and this gets to some of the differences with liberal ordination also. She does not count in the minyan. So when she serves in a congregation and they need a minyan, they need a 10th person to fill the minyan, she might have to go and get her husband. And a number of women who shared this with, who spoke to me about this, shared that, awkwardness, frustration, there are a variety of emotions that come with that. Exhaustion, embarrassment, there are a variety of emotions, but that's some of the tension, right? It's like, it's funny, but it also kind of highlights some of the limitations or the boundaries, right? There's still certain boundaries. And the last thing I will say, and this is just kind of to which the ordination of women in Orthodoxy is also changing Orthodoxy writ large. And this is, we have this phrase called the feminization. You might have heard of the feminization of Judaism. There was a lot of fear when women started first getting ordained in the liberal movements, that all of the men were going to leave Reform Judaism and conservative men would disappear, because what's the point of being in a congregation if there are female authority figures? Okay, so that's kind of one piece of what we call the feminization of Judaism, that theory of feminization. That didn't really happen, but that was a big fear. But the other way to think of feminization of Judaism, and I refer to it within the feminization of the clergy, is to think of how the clergy has changed because of the import of certain feminine characteristics. And here my example is from Yeshiva University, which is the flagship, has the flagship seminary for ordaining men in Orthodoxy, based in New York. A couple years ago, they decided to partner with their School of Psychology. And they now offer a track for the men who are getting ordained to get a degree at this, a dual degree in psychology, so that, and this is from some of their promotional materials, they can offer better pastoral care to the congregation. And when I think about that, I think about the fact that, okay, maybe we refer to this as the feminization of the Orthodox rabbinate, right? Now YU is using some of those same sort of characteristics we identify as feminine, okay? Or maybe what we're seeing actually is that Yeshivat Maharat's extensive pastoral care program has influenced the way everybody does rabbinical school, right? And maybe it didn't start with Yeshivat Maharat, but it's for sure influenced in a way that it wasn't before. So I'm going to stop there, and I'll let Maharat Rory pick up, and then I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Michal. And now I'm going to hand it over, as she said, to Rory, to Maharat Rory.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Karen, for pulling all of this together. And it was actually really fun when I first learned about Dr. Michal's research, and I think it kind of started because you did a presentation, and I think I messaged you and I said, like, what is this about? And it's kind of like so interesting to have lived through it not so long ago, and now kind of hear the scholarly perspective on all of it, and in many ways I think validate some of my own experiences through your research. So I just want to pick up on a couple of pieces of it in sharing some of my own experience, and then really open it up for the dialogue, because I always feel like I don't know which part is more interesting for other people. I know what I've done, but so I'm kind of curious to see where the questions go. But there's just, I think one of the things is always really interesting. I think whenever we start talking about topics, right, there's always sort of like topics, and then there's like the feminine version of topics, right? And there's always this way that we kind of add this extra layer where we don't really talk, right? Like now, I mean, we do talk about kind of the male rabbinate, but like we don't, usually we just mean the rabbinate, right, is kind of male, and then there's suddenly this feminization of the rabbinate, and it's something I just want to highlight also, because I think in doing this, I never really felt like a woman doing this. I grew up in an incredibly religious, fervent Orthodox household in Brooklyn, New York, so like a pretty right-wing Jewish neighborhood. We didn't really, I guess we'd be classified as like right-wing Orthodox, but at the time we just thought of ourselves as Jewish. I don't even know that we really thought of ourselves as Orthodox, although we sort of had a sense of other Judaisms. I grew up with 3 brothers, and in many ways I think I was sort of naive. Like I was just as passionate about my Judaism as they were. And I was taught that there were things that women were not obligated to do. And then we were sort of always explained, right? Like women didn't have to go, didn't have to sit in the sukkah in the same way that men did, because women are not obligated in these positive time-bound commandments. And the explanation of it was, because women had other things, right? Women maybe had to be the primary people taking care of children or things like that. And, when I was, I don't even know, 16, 17, right, I didn't have children of my own to take care of. My younger brother was 3 years younger than me. Like I was living a pretty good life with my mom taking care of everything. And so, I would go to services like my brothers would, and get these like sideways look, because women didn't show up on time, right? Like you didn't get there when services started at 8:30. You got there at 10 or 9:30 or whatever it was. I wanted to study like my brothers did, and it's really fascinating for me, because I found myself in this kind of liberal end of Orthodoxy, not necessarily because I have a liberal view of Orthodoxy, but because inherent to being a woman and wanting to then be religiously Orthodox and live out that life professionally, that made me a liberal Orthodox Jew. Or right, in some ways, right? So and so for me, it wasn't like I'm going to be a woman doing this. It was, this is what I was taught to do. I was taught to want to study and to want to continue my study. And I remember literally kind of hitting a brick wall when suddenly I kind of got to the next thing I wanted to study, and going to some teachers or just even my brothers and saying, "Can you help me with these texts?" And then looking at me and saying, "Why do you want to know what this says?" And there was like a sense of like, I wasn't supposed to be able to access this. And so when I come at this work, I don't feel like I'm a woman doing this work. I feel like with the rest of us, right, we all come with our full selves. And part of who I am is is being female and the way that that identity has meant that I've walked through the world and experiences that I've had, absolutely, combined with thousands of other ways that one could classify me. And so it's both interesting to look at me and my colleagues and see the ways that we as women have entered this differently. I think in part because the world has trained us to walk through it differently as women. And then the ways that we're also countlessly different from one another because, I grew up in New York as opposed to someone who grew up in California, or I grew up Orthodox and some people grew up in the Reform community, or whatever ways, right? We walk through with our full selves, and being female is one of those angles, but not the only one. And so it's interesting sometimes to be asked to comment on what my experience is when I don't know sort of like which part of me is like the female part that's like reacting, right? I go through with kind of the combination of all of that. Just a couple of other points I want to really lift up. I love this this analogy of the Rebbitzin rabbi. I think that is something that many of us have experienced. And I think also raises some challenges for us in many ways because for many years, the role of the Rebbitzin was an unpaid role. And I think that also really talks about role of women in general, right? Where that was, you would hire a rabbi, a male rabbi, and the rabbi came with a wife, and the wife was just going to be unpaid labor. And I think for many of us, we felt like part of what we got to do was sort of reclaim, right? Like if we were going to do pastoral counseling and we were going to teach classes, which might have actually, and for some of our congregations, that had been the role of a rebbitzin beforehand, which some of us didn't necessarily mind that, except that one, we were going to be trained for it. So it wasn't just because we married into it, but two, we were going to get paid accordingly for it. And I think that's both hard because some places feel like we got it for free for so long, but that's part of kind of the battle of saying you need to recognize what women's contributions are. And tying it kind of all back to I think where Rabbi Karen also started us off, I think it's just the remembering that where Orthodoxy is different from all of the other denominations within Judaism is that we are a totally decentralized denomination. And so Yeshiva University is the flagship, but does not speak for all of Orthodoxy. We have organizations that, like the Orthodox Union, that kind of try to. They're a wide range organization, most famous for the OU, right, the kosher symbol. Every few years, the OU puts out a statement that says women can't be ordained as rabbis, and if somebody responds and says stick to tuna fish, and we continue on with our cycle. So there is nobody who can kind of decide this. And what that means, I'm glad this is getting a good laugh. What that means, though, is that on the one hand, there was no one moment, right? Like JTS had a vote. HUC like formally decided to do this. There was no kind of moment other than, what Rev Avi Weiss and what Rabbi Sarah Hurwitz kind of realized was, well, we can just do it. And basically, if the community accepts it, then we did it. And if they don't, right? And so, you got like people who might come and say, well, you can't be a rabbi. And the answer is like, I just did. And so it's this kind of fascinating because, and I feel a little bit better now, kind of 7 years later, but which is astounding, by the way, right? 7 years is not that long of time, but even for a long time within the first few years, and I'd say even now, there was kind of a feeling of we are making a history that hasn't been written. We could go through this process, and the first couple of years, we were in school, we didn't know if graduates would get jobs. And then the first year got jobs, but with the second year and with the third. And there was kind of a feeling of, this could be a footnote in a history book that somebody would write, where it would be like, yeah, for 10 years, there was this experiment, but then it failed, and, now it's gone. Which is why it's kind of especially amazing to see your research, Michal, like to see like you're writing the chapters in the books, right? Like it's not a footnote anymore, right? There's actually so much more to it. And so yeah, we don't really know. I mean, that's really where I just want to lift up the community, because it's the community that gets to make this decision. And I would say largely the Orthodox community, but not exclusively. For me, getting to work in an Orthodox congregation was hugely important, but being seen in the wider St. Louis community and accepting me as Jewish leadership and Orthodox Jewish leadership has a huge impact, because ultimately the authority that I have comes from the community granting me that authority. And that's something that I never take for granted.
Thank you both so much. This is Wonderful. I have a lot of questions, but I'm getting a lot of positive feedback. So thank you for speaking your truth and your research and everything. It's so wonderful to hear you all. Okay, I'm going to group some of these together because some of them are about just the logistics of being a maharat. Are you allowed to perform a wedding? And what does it look like for an Orthodox woman rabbi to also have a family? Like, how do they balance the roles that are traditional, like Jewish women's roles in the home versus working in a synagogue? And also the third kind of along those lines is the pay difference between Orthodox men rabbis and Orthodox women rabbis. I think you kind of alluded to that. And so people wanted to, so those are, I kind of grouped those together, but if, I don't know who wants to speak to that, but if one of you wants to jump in.
So I can just start off by saying, practically, I've thus far done 3 weddings. So far, I've been told they're all legal. So fingers crossed on that. No, so my colleagues and I, we do weddings, we do funerals, we do baby namings. It becomes really interesting because I often say that the big difference between the role that I have and the role that a male rabbi would have in the Orthodox community is really the same as the difference between men and women in Orthodoxy. So I don't count for the minyan, for the quorum of 10 to qualify for communal prayer, but the rabbi doesn't count like more for the minyan, right? Like that's not because he's a rabbi that he counts as a man. I would say the same, I don't lead prayers. But again, it's not exclusively that the rabbi is the one who's leading prayers. Any knowledgeable man who is above the age of 13 and qualifies to pray for the community is able to do so. And so the differences between us are not differences that are because of our ordinations. Our ordinations sort of qualify us like equally to do more than what other people do, but the things I don't do are the things I didn't do before I was ordained, if that makes sense. The role of family becomes really interesting and complicated, and this is where we've really looked to women in the conservative and reform rabbinates as models for this, because we have the same problems that everybody else has. I moved to St. Louis to work at Beis Abraham congregation in 2013. My daughter was 2 months old when I started, and so I interviewed while pregnant, which like, you know, everyone tells you you're never supposed to do, and so it just brought with it all different kinds of challenges of people trying to figure out, you know, how they wanted to see my role, right? And there's a tension with that also, because on the one hand, you know, you're sort of judged more so because, can you really focus on your job and not be distracted by your children? But then the flip side of it is right, people who think like you're not paying enough attention to your children. And this is not in the Orthodox community. I think Rabbi Karen could probably speak to this as well. I mean, I think this is true for women in lots of careers. And certainly I had the experience that Dr. Michal was talking about, where I would go to Minyan, there would be 9 men and me. I would go back home and I'd say to my husband, they need you to be the 10th. He would go, and then I would be doing bedtime, and then he'd come back and he'd say, well, there's a break. You should really be there for the break because this is your job. You need to show that you're present. And I would go back and he would take over, and then I'd say, okay, now it's time for the minyan again. And right, so we would do all of that. And I don't know, I'm sure some people thought like I was being horribly irresponsible because I was leaving my kids. Some people thought I was dedicated to my job. Was I too dedicated to my job? All of those things. And that's like, again, though, that's true for all women. That's not exclusive. And in terms of pay, I don't know, and Michal might know this actually better. I mean, it's interesting because I think this is where I think there's like been more of a push by women professionally in general to share pay scales. I think this is like a more recent phenomenon across the board, and particularly in the Jewish communal world. I will say many of us who are working right now in the field are, who are in congregations, are working as kind of number 2s to senior male rabbis for whom like they have been in their pulpits more, and so they are getting paid more. What we're getting paid compared to what a man in the same position would get paid, it's hard in some ways because, again, since the Orthodox community does not have where, like, I believe the Reform and conservative communities have sort of like designated pay scales, we don't, which sometimes undermines us because I think when we were first looking at jobs, there was sort of, I remember like talking to people to say like, am I supposed to negotiate? What do I need to do? And there was sort of a feeling of like, if they offer you a job, just take it, right? Because we were so panicked, like, no, because again, our authority comes from like, do we get a job? And so I probably totally undersold myself in my first job. But I don't know if we really, I mean, I think that's still something that we're not really sharing widely. And I don't know if there is research on that.
Yeah, so the payment is part of this survey. Maharat Rory, you'll get a survey from me sometime in the next 6 months to share your it's definitely the data is information that people want. I hear that from other women working in the field. I hear that from people who are giving grants or funding Yeshivat Maharat. They want to know what women are getting paid in the field. As Maharat Rory pointed out, there are a number of complications. One being that the women are serving in assistant rabbi capacities. And actually a number of the congregations that women are serving in didn't have assistant male rabbis that they could compare, that could even serve as a kind of comparison. And most of the congregations, what the rabbis tell me is they're not even big enough to have assistant rabbis, but either they themselves as the head male rabbis were committed to having a female rabbi working there as well, or a number of people in the congregation were committed to having a female rabbi working there. And so they've put funds together, and the funds come from a variety of sources. And the other thing that, other people might be familiar with, calculating rabbis' salaries who work in congregations is kind of complicated because of, I'm blanking on the term, but, some of them get money for housing and some of them, and the
Parsonage.
Thank you. The parsonage. So whenever I ask this question, there's a very complicated answer. So some of that data is stuff that I'm collecting now and trying to figure out. But I will also say to this point, and then I'm going to get to something that was raised before, is that actually the number of women serving in congregations is very low. Most of the women who have graduated from Yeshivat Maharat are not in congregations. They're in educational roles, in schools or in different foundations. They serve as, I'm blanking on the word. It's an hour later here for me, so you'll have to forgive me. In hospitals as chaplains or in administrative type roles, so the pay scale is just kind of all over the place because of the wide variety of careers that they've fashioned for themselves. So that's something else to keep in mind. In terms of this point about the fact that the Rebbitzin was unpaid labor, this is so fascinating because now the Orthodox movement is also training Rebbitzins to do a lot of work and paying them. So I work on a college campus at Rutgers where we have Jewish life JLICs, Jewish life something coordinators. They're trained by the Orthodox Union as a married couple. They're both receive training to work on college campuses. He's a rabbi, she's not, but they're paid as a couple to work on the college campus. It's kind of similar to the Chabad model. And Chabad women also, the wives also get training to be shluchot, to be the emissaries. So there's a sort of interesting dynamic here where the Rebbitzin role is also being professionalized in a really interesting way. The last thing I'll say about family, Maharat Rory's experiences, I've heard from almost everybody who's married. There is, though, another phenomenon that a number of women tell me about, which is that if they are not married when they enter rabbinical school, when they enter Yeshivat Maharat, it's tough for them to get married subsequently. And a lot of that has to do with the gender norms within Orthodoxy. They're looking for a partner who is like them, who is Orthodox. And it's tough to find an Orthodox man who wants to marry a female rabbi. And that's just some of the gender dynamics that we see in Orthodoxy. But again, as was pointed out, some of that is common among professional women, across the spectrum. So, of a variety of professions. So, yeah.
They talk about that in our rabbinical school as well, that it's really hard. If you aren't like partnered off before rabbinical school, it can be very hard after to find someone.
Right.
So that might be, I hear you.
Because educated women are intimidating. Yeah.
In an Orthodox setting, I would see that.
Right.
So can you speak to just how many like Maharats have been ordained, and if there's a trend where the classes are growing? Like, I know when women started coming to, I meant to say this earlier, but when women started coming to the Reform movement, there were 1 or 2 women per class. My class, which I started in 2006, was 2/3 women. Wow. It was there were 43 of us, and I think 31 women and 13 men, which is pretty remarkable. Except I will say I only had 3 women professors in rabbinical school. So you can sort of see the trend there. But like, how many Maharats are getting ordained? How large are these classes? And are they growing in size?
Great. So there are now a total of 43 women, I believe, who have been 42, 43, who have received smicha from Yeshivat Maharat. And that includes the most recent crop of 9 who received smicha a few weeks ago. So 9 is a pretty big class. I think 9 is the biggest class they've had. The classes started out kind of small, 3, 5. Maharat Rory, how many were in your class?
2.
2. So they started off pretty small. One thing that Yeshivat Maharat did is a couple of years ago, they opened up an executive ordination track. And this was kind of unofficial for a few years. And now it's really official. And this year they graduated, the majority of women who received smicha were from the executive ordination track, I believe. And that's for women who have already been working in the field for a number of years. They often have advanced degrees already. And they just need a little bit of extra training in a couple of different areas, and they get a more individually tailored educational experience. What has happened over the last couple of years is the women who, and this is what happens in 8 years, okay? When the first couple of classes graduated, they left college, or they entered college, and this wasn't an option for them. They didn't think to themselves, oh, I'm gonna get a degree in religion and then I'm gonna become a rabbi. That wasn't. Now, right, 8 years later, women enter Maharat saying, when I started college, I knew this was where I was gonna be. So they're going directly from college. So you have these kind of 2 groups at Maharat now. You have some who are 22, fresh out of college, who wanted to do this for her entire life. She knew Maharats growing up. She saw this whole movement. She started college saying, what's going to best prepare me to go to Yeshivat Maharat? So you have that crop. And then you have other women who have been doing other amazing careers for their entire lives, who are also at Yeshivat Maharat. And they're learning, somewhat together. There's a lot of Zoom learning that went on even before coronavirus, but yeah. Did I get it? Did you want to add anything? Yeah.
No, that was wonderful. Thank you. So Maharat Rory, we have a question for you, and maybe Michal, you can speak to this, Dr. Michal, to your larger research. Was your family supportive of your decision to become a Maharat?
I get that question a lot, and mostly, yeah. I mean, it's kind of mixed. So, it was really interesting because. So I want to first actually comment on what was just said in terms of, because I know so many of the women who this just didn't really who would have been on this track, right? There's also a lot of women in the Orthodox community who never did go back for this, right? They would have been on this track. They were educators, or maybe they studied in higher education. They might have gotten like a master's in Talmud, and then they just hit too many glass ceilings and went totally different directions. And when Maharat started, just felt like I missed the boat already. I feel really lucky in that I was just totally in the right place at the right time. When Rabbi Sarah was conferred at the time, it was 2009. It was actually really interesting, as many of you know, the economy had crashed, so it might feel kind of right. And I had lost my job. I was working in the Jewish communal world. I had lost my job. I was sort of figuring out what came next, and this opportunity kind of came up, and so I was literally not doing anything else, and I feel really lucky because there's a lot of women for whom that wasn't an option. And so for me, it was interesting because I feel like I sort of fell into it, and it wasn't something that I really broadcast. We didn't really know what it was. I was not in a community where this was a conversation at all, and there were like, we sort of had known, right? Like the right-wing Jewish newspapers were sort of starting to talk about it in a pretty negative way. And so I remember, like, there was some negative press around it, and I was kind of nervous. And I remember telling my parents, and my parents had grown up in the conservative world, and so like not really in an insular Orthodox community. And what was really interesting is that my parents knew Avi Weiss for his advocacy on Soviet Jewry. Right, that was kind of like in the 80s and 90s. That's really where he made his name. He was highly respected, and so there was sort of this feeling of like, oh, Avi Weiss, no, he's a good guy. Like, we'll go along with that, right? And so they were pretty supportive of it. My brothers mostly just don't really talk about it, and so it's kind of funny because I have one brother who once in a while will sort of like try to make conversation with me about some new book that he has that's like totally not at all in the realm of anything that I would do. One of my brothers, sometimes he'll kind of look at my bookshelf and he'll be like, I don't know these books. One of my brothers, we just like, it just never really comes up. My extended family has been incredibly supportive. But I will really give my mom credit because in my neighborhood in Brooklyn, I was really just not talking about it. I just sort of like, I did not want to have the conversation with people. It was just kind of a headache. And so I'd bump into people maybe I went to high school with or who knew me before. I'd started and they'd say like, what are you up to? And I'd say, oh, I'm doing some learning, and that was like, okay, right? Like women's learning at that point was sort of more acceptable. So that was kind of cool. But I wouldn't really go into detail. And my mom would be like, oh, I was at the butcher and I saw your high school teacher. She asked how you were doing. And she asked what you were up to. And I was like, did you tell her? And of course I told her. And I was sort of mortified. And I said, well, what was the response? And my mom would say, as she would tell people, there would sort of be this like awkward pause. And then there would be this nod of like, that makes sense for Rory. And that was really interesting because that's, I think, when I first realized, like, ultimately, we weren't changing, like, it wasn't just about a movement, it was about individual people. I used to joke, like, we're a lot less scary when you actually get to know us. And so I think there was sort of a feeling of, like, this kind of, like, women trying to overthrow the rabbinate was this kind of craziness. But then there would be the individual people who were like, oh, no, she was just always someone who was really passionate. She's someone who liked to help people. No, she'll be fine. So that was really, I know that's a much broader answer. To this day, I think, my parents are incredibly supportive. My brothers still just kind of don't bring it up. My sister-in-laws like may or may not totally understand what it is that I do. And I have aunts and uncles who are incredibly supportive and thrilled, and we're just kind of all across the spectrum on it.
Thank you. Michal, do you want to jump in with any other researcher stories along those lines?
I guess the only thing I'll add, number one, that's a common narrative that I hear from other people too, that initially families might have been a little concerned or reticent, and then they realize, no, this is really the role you've always been meant to fill. And part of that, I think, is due to a question that perhaps some of you have that I had also, or that I never admitted that I had to my interviewees because they hate this question, but I always try to get at it in some way, which is, why didn't you just go to a movement that was already ordaining women? And their answer is something, listen, my PhD is in religious studies. I should know this answer, but I kind of needed to hear it from them, which is, I'm Orthodox. That's what I am. There is no separating Orthodoxy from me. And that's that, and once their families realize that, and they realize that, again, they're not trying to overthrow Orthodoxy, they're actually trying to be their best Orthodox selves. I can't think of any family that reacted negatively after that.
If I can, I just want to add on to that, because I yes, like 100% to that, and that's been my answer also. For me, there's one extra piece to it, which is not only am I fundamentally Orthodox, right, but I believe that Orthodoxy has a place for women,
Right.
And this idea, right, and I think we can, right, that if we self-segregate, right, if we say that to be a woman in leadership is to then, for those who want to talk about kids and family, right, to be a woman in leadership is to self-segregate and to say I need to become conservative, then what we're basically doing is ceding Orthodoxy to be an exclusively male space, which I don't think it ever was. I mean, I didn't grow up in an Orthodoxy that didn't have a space for women. I don't think that's accurate.
Thank you for, hi Shemaya, I see you. Hi Shemaya.
He can't hear you because Rabbi Karen says hi.
Thank you. There's one other question that was posed. I'm going to try to ask it correctly. But is the ordination, I think, Michal, you mentioned ordination of women in Israel. And so there's a question about the ordination of women in Israel within the Orthodox movement to give maybe more power to the Orthodox movement, knowing the Reform movement also ordains women, and so does the conservative movement. Have you come across anything?
Yeah, Israel is a tough nut to crack on this topic. I've been thinking a lot about what's going on in Israel in terms of women's Orthodox ordination, and I'll say just a couple of things. One, I haven't fully figured it out yet, so these thoughts are really preliminary. But first of all, there isn't as much opposition to women's ordination in Orthodoxy in Israel. And I think that significantly has to do with the fact that, well, two things. One, synagogues operate differently in Israel. So synagogues don't form the core of Jewish communal identity in Israel. So most of the women who are getting smicha in Israel are not serving in synagogues. So that this kind of, the place where the conflict happens in America is not a place of conflict for this topic in Israel. I think that's one piece of the puzzle. The other piece of the puzzle is that the Orthodox establishment in Israel is very secure in its place in Israeli society. It is funded heavily by the government. It is supported in any number of ways. It is the default religious practice all over Israel. They're not threatened by the ordination of a few women the way that certain Orthodox establishments or Orthodoxy to some extent in America, I think, feels threatened by the ordination of a few women. And so those are kind of two things that are going on. Like, for instance, in Israel, there is a yeshiva that is ordaining under Orthodox auspices, that is ordaining men and women together. And this seems to get very little coverage, very little fanfare, no opposite, no, like, it's just not, so there's that. The more interesting story for me, so that's kind of something I want to figure out and maybe have some more coherent thoughts about. But the more interesting story for me is how the ordination of women has been a kind of cross-Atlantic project. So one of the rabbis who signs the certificates for women at Yeshivat Maharat is a very well-known established rabbi in Israel. Many of the women who have been ordained at Yeshivat Maharat are Israeli in some sense of the term. So there's something going on in, I don't know, a cross-fertilization, or maybe there's a certain legitimacy that Israeli Orthodoxy offers to Yeshivat Maharat. It's not entirely, these are some of the things you'll have to stay tuned for when I come back in 3 years to do the book talk. But now you're just getting the research talk.
That was helpful. Thank you. Because I think oftentimes we think about what it looks like in America, but, people really think about these trends in Israel as well, for sure.
Can I say one more thing about what's going on in Israel? Can I? Okay.
Yeah.
So what, and this just gets at a lot of people ask about titles. A lot of women in Israel who are very educated and don't have smicha go use the title Rabbanit, which has now also become, which Rabbanit can mean a lot of things in Israel now. It can mean a very educated woman. It can mean a woman who has smicha. It could mean a rabbi's wife. And you only know from the context. And the interesting thing is that of the 9 women who received smicha at Yeshiva Maharat a few weeks ago, 7 of them are now using the title Rabbanit. Rabbanit is becoming the most popular title among Musmachot at Yeshiva Maharat. So again, there's kind of something going on. I don't like harping too much on titles because it's only a title, and yet at the same time, I think the title is doing a lot of work that I want to tease out a little bit more.
And if I can actually jump in on titles, because I think this is also, this could be another hour in and of itself, but because I do agree. I mean, I think this is where, for many of us, a lot of us have been doing this work in ways prior, and the recognition that a title, it opens doors, right? There's a different way that somebody walks into a room and introduces themselves as professor or doctor or rabbi, and everyone sort of knows the role that they play. And so I really appreciate how Dr. Michal laid out kind of the history in terms of where I think it was really important in the early years that I think if Avi Weiss had gotten up and said, we're ordaining women as rabbis, I don't think it would have taken hold in the way that it did take hold. And I also, I do disagree with some of the decisions that were made ultimately, that the school decided that they did not want to engage in the debate around titles. When Rabbi Sarah changed her title to Rabbah, it was a huge scandal. The Rabbinical Council of America was threatening to kick Avi Weiss out. Fast forward, he quit anyway, but for a different reason later. And I remember being around the table, right? I remember sitting there as like Rav Avi was going to be going to these negotiations with the RCA. And I remember sitting there with this group of women, because at the time the RCA was not letting the Chovevei rabbis in. And we said, okay, we'll trade it. We'll, you let the Chovevei rabbis in and we won't take Rabat. Like we were all these kind of brainstorming. And ultimately the school kind of the hands-off way to do it was to say, we give the degree, we don't give the title. But what's happened actually is that it's really hard, because I think for many of us who do this work, and for anyone where this work is challenging, and particularly being a woman in a male-dominated field, what we've lost is a certain sense of like a cohort, right? Because now, right, like I took Maharat. All of us in the first few years took Maharat. A number of people changed over time. I haven't, partially because like I've been in St. Louis for 7 years, and like all the Catholics now know what a Maharat is. So, I don't like, it'd be more confusing to explain why I can change a title. But what happens is now is that I'll meet people and they'll say, oh, so you're a Maharat, what's that? Oh, I know somebody who's a Rabbanit. And then you have to sort of like explain, right? And how is my training different? So did I do more school, or a Rabbanit is a higher title? And to explain that there's actually now anywhere between 5 and 8 titles that all actually refer to the same degree. And some of those titles which actually can refer to no degree, but to a certain level of experience or marriage. So it's really hard, because what we've lost is a sense of right, of like where you kind of want to sort of be like, oh, cool, I've never met you, but you live in Israel, and you're also doing the exact same thing that I am, or kind of the recognition. I did see, because I am looking also kind of at the chat. So I know there was a question about studying in Israel. We don't have an obligation to study in Israel for a year, which I think is also true, by the way, in I don't think Yeshiva University, I don't think any of the Orthodox rabbinical schools require a year in Israel the way that the liberal institutions do. So I did want to just touch on that. But yeah, so it's one of the things that I sort of I bemoan the fact that, as women who are kind of facing a lot of obstacles in this work, that's one of the ways that we're not able to support each other. There's sort of a way, I mean, we're certainly supportive of each other, but there's kind of, earlier on in the years, we would, I would go to a conference and I would meet somebody and they'd say, you're a Maharat. And I'd start this, and they'd say, no, I know Maharat Ruth. I go to her synagogue in DC. And it was like, oh, cool, right? Like, it's so suddenly, we were breaking down doors for each other. And that's not happening in the same sort of way.
Rory, you mentioned having like a cohort. Is there some sort of like group for Orthodox women rabbis?
Not exclusively. So after the RCA, the Rabbinical Council of America, which was originally the union. So there's the Union of Orthodox Rabbis, but that's kind of another name anyway, because there's an Orthodox union, right? But that was like the union, right? They give like health insurance and stuff like that. And the RCA wouldn't let them in. So Avi Weiss, together with Rabbi Mark Angel, started the International Rabbinic Fellowship, which is kind of like the alternative. And you have a number of people who have leadership positions in both institutions. So kind of like the liberal rabbis who were ordained by YU are now members of both. And the IRF voted a number of years ago to allow women to join. So like I am a member of the International Rabbinic Fellowship. It's not exclusively for women, it's for men and women in the Orthodox community who qualify for their membership.
Cool. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Is there anything either of you would like to add to our conversation before I close? Are we good? Okay. So I just want to thank Maharat Rory Picker-Nice and Dr. Michal Rauscher one more time. Not only are they colleagues and scholars, but they're dear friends of mine. And so I feel so much like goodness in myself being, I was gonna say up here with both of you, but we're on Zoom, but like presenting with both of you and being surrounded by your knowledge. Thank you so much for sharing with us. And I really can't thank you enough for being here this evening. Next week, we continue our discussion. We will lose Maharat Rory and we will miss her, but we will continue with Dr. Michal Rauscher and we will talk about the Unorthodox series and a lot of, I would say symbolism is the wrong word, but there's so much to unpack about this series when it comes to women and what it means for Esti and what it means in a Hasidic community. And so we will continue this conversation with her next week. Please watch the show. We're going to assume anyone has seen the show, whether or not you have. If you're on the Zoom, we're going to assume you've seen it. And if you could submit questions beforehand as well, you'll have time to submit questions that evening. But if there are lots of the same questions, I'd love to go on and work with Michal on some of those answers and shaping the conversation. Anything you want to add?
I was just gonna say, I will send you the titles of those books.
So great. I got one of them and put it in the chat. And I missed the one by
Shirley Schwartz here.
I got Shirley Schwartz, but I missed the title by Pam Nadal.
Okay.
So the other one's in the chat higher up.
Okay, here, I'm putting it in right now.
And thank you all.
I think you only sent that to the panelists.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay.
If you have any other questions, you can always email me. I'm happy to touch base with either of these two remarkable women to get you information again. So thank you all for joining us. And thank you again. This was so wonderful. And I will see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.